Hey guys, Argent Templar here with a long-awaited reactionary review of Narcos. So if you haven't seen Narcos, go watch it. If you have Netflix, you can go see it now. If you don't, find some way to watch it. Narcos is absolutely amazing, and it's only 10 episodes long. At least season 1's only 10 episodes long. I think we have to give HBO a lot of credit for limiting seasons of new TV shows to 10 episodes, but making them more dense. Like I find a lot of the newer shows like Game of Thrones or Breaking Bad or a lot of these kind of pay channel shows tended to be a lot more compressed. They tend to have more of a story arc, and there's like very little to no monster of the week. Like another show I watch a lot of is The Blacklist, and it has like 20 episodes per season, but less happens in those than in 10 episodes of Game of Thrones. And less happens in 3 seasons of The Blacklist than happens in 1 season of Narcos. So Narcos has a lot of good things going for it. You mainly, I guess, want me to talk about the political aspects, so we'll get to that. So Narcos is the tale of Pablo Escobar, which is a great concept for a TV show, and the show is self-aware of this. I believe the first line of it, or one of the first lines of it, was magical realism was found in Colombia because it's a country too strange to be believed. And the show really, I think, continues that. And the whole magical realism line is referenced a couple times. There's just a ton of just improbable things that happen. Just a lot of bizarreness. It's just surreal, particularly to someone from a more developed country, or Colombia's not even that undeveloped a country. Okay, a more stable country. Just the kind of weird stuff that goes on here. Um, so the show opens. I won't go through a complete plot summary. Just gonna go through some interesting things and talk about their political relevance. So the show opens with the Pinochet regime. Now you may be going, well, what does Pinochet have to do with Narcos? And it's a good question, but the show is actually really red pilled because it goes, we backed Pinochet. He said he was like, et cetera, et cetera. He abused human rights, yada yada, all that liberal stuff. But then it goes, the narcotics industry was born in Chile, and I'm like, well, I've never heard of really drug cartels being in Chile. Chile is regarded as being a stable country with a very low murder rate, at least by Latin American standards. And it goes, Pinochet didn't like disorder or threats to his rule. So Narcos started up there. They started growing cocaine. They started making cocaine labs. And what Pinochet did was he gathered up. He sent out the secret police. He gathered up all the narcos. He made them dig a mass grave, and he machine gunned all the narcos into the mass grave. The one survivor of that was this guy here, Cockroach. Cockroach would later go on to found the Peruvian cartel, but he basically killed like 90% of the drug cartels. Whoever was left was scared out of their minds and fled Chile. And to this day, Chile does not have a big drug cartel problem. I'm sure you can find examples that it does, but compared to Colombia, where they controlled like half the country, and Mexico, where they were able to cause governments to fall with their power, Chile is relatively cartel free. So automatically, the show is kind of red pilled because it's like it has the kind of the standard. Oh, Pinochet was a big meanie stuff. At the same time, it shows it worked. Um, Kind of gutting down a bunch of people who are frankly scumbags who sell drugs that kill hundreds of thousands. Gutting them down saved his country from what would be probably one of the greatest menaces of Latin America, the drug cartels. So Cockroach flees to Peru, which is an extremely poor, underdeveloped country that's also beset by civil war. And Cockroach decides that he wants to extend the drug trade north into the relatively more wealthy Colombia. So he goes and he finds Pablo Escobar. Pablo Escobar he's an interesting figure. He's largely a psychopathic mass murderer. but there's a bit more complexity to him. I think he, to a large extent, kind of is the embodiment of everything kind of. I wouldn't say good, but he's just kind of the embodiment of Latin America. He's full of Latin rage, and I don't mean that just in like a New World context. If you look at what like Italy and Spain were like, they used to have a lot of dueling. Latin peoples just tend to be rather hot-blooded. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's just kind of how they are. Like if you ever met it, Italians and Spaniards tend to be very passionate um, people. It's why they produce a lot of good music, a lot of good artistic stuff, because they're deeply emotional, and that can often lead to fits of anger. And in Latin America, which is relatively conservative, conservative meaning it hasn't changed as much. The kind of the forces of modernism and liberalism haven't really affected as much. So I think in a lot of ways it probably more resembles what Spain and Italy were like a couple hundred years ago than Spain and Italy do now. There's very much the whole machismo patriarchal thing going. So Pablo Escobar basically comes into an agreement with Cockroach that he's going to run the Colombian side of the business. Now, Cockroach initially just wants to sell it in Colombia because he can sell it for, I don't know, 5 times as much as in Peru, because Colombia is not really a poor country by Latin American standards. It has a lot of issues. Colombia, I think, is one of the more interesting countries in Latin America because it has a lot of good things about it and a lot of very bad things about it. While it had one of the highest murder rates, its government was relatively uncorrupt compared to a lot of countries, at least for a country as rolling in drug money and stuff. And also, I think, despite its immense troubles, has shown more willingness to kind of improve. So Pablo Escobar basically says, well, we can sell it in Colombia, that's fine, but really what we need to do is, because of Colombia's position, is get it to America, because we can sell it for 100 times what you could sell it in Peru. And so the whole cartel thing starts. And really what propels it is money. The first couple times they ship in the drugs, they initially start out by like having fake pockets in hiding it in cameras, having fake pockets in suits. The Americans aren't really looking for narcotics because this is kind of before the era of the narco. So the first couple shipments net them tens of thousands of American dollars. Now, if you think about it, I forget if they stated exactly, but like a peasant in Colombia, I think would make like for relative, like a couple $100 a year, maybe. Americans. So if they're starting to make even like a couple $100,000 a year, they can literally start hiring like hundreds of people. They can start paying mules. They don't even have to pay the mules that much. I mean, they can pay the mules basically what a peasant would earn in a year for a 3-day trip to America to smuggle the drugs in, and they'll make enough money to hire 100 more mules, or maybe like a couple hundred more mules. And over time, as they get that money, they can invest in more bribes. Bribes meaning that the army will look the other way as they ship in more cocaine. They can invest in more labs. They can invest in. It's kind of a funny thing on how capitalism works. So they get increasing amounts of money. They can do a lot of investments that approve it. So they can invest in better cocaine production facilities, like stuff to refine it better, to make better product, to come up with more innovative ways of hiding it, to pay off the army to let them bring in more and more cocaine into Colombia, and just continually expand their operations. And because Colombia is so much poorer than America, they make literally so much money, and this is kind of where the magical realism thing comes in. They have to start burying cash, because they have like literally thousands of sicarios, which are a sicario is kind of like a hitman, but Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel has literally like thousands of them on the payroll, all of whom have like machine pistols, normally like Uzis or Ingrams, and so they'll have those. They'll have thousands of chemists, and they make so much money, and the money's worth so much more in Colombia. They don't really know what to do with all of it. So, like, there's scenes where Pablo Escobar just starts throwing bundles of cash to the people of Medellin, where he's from, because he literally has no use for the money. He's basically, they are making hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's not an exaggeration. In the 1970s, in a country where probably the average income was a couple hundred American, maybe $1,000 American. So they also have to just start burying money. So they bury like hundreds of millions of dollars in the ground because they literally just have no use for it. But they keep expanding production. They keep getting more and more control. And we kind of see a brief, kind of almost redeemable part of Pablo Escobar's life. Because he came from extreme poverty in Medellin, and he wants to give back to a certain extent. He kind of fancies himself a man of the people, even if he really doesn't live up to this in most cases. So Pablo Escobar basically, what he decides, sorry about that, is that he's going to give back. So he goes and he builds like a hospital, a full hospital in Medellin. He builds clinics. He builds a lot of housing. Excuse me. He provides subsidized food. He gives out just immense amounts of money to the public and develops Medellin. And he is a hero there. And we see this later on that whenever he has to hide in Medellin, the people won't give him up. Because as brutal as he is, he's brought immense wealth to one of the poorest parts of Colombia. And we see him during this time period, despite being a brutal mass murderer, and he is shown to be a complete psychopath, he has this belief that he wants to be the president of Colombia. Excuse me. He thinks with his immense wealth and his immense power that he can govern Colombia. Now it's important to note, and this is kind of what's so fantastic about it, he probably makes more money than Colombia's GDP. I've seen stats that it's like a huge portion of Colombia's exports were just his drug empire. The Medellin cartel, it's estimated, made hundreds of billions of dollars, and this is the 1970s and 80s. Later in the show, when he gets exiled basically to Panama, he offers to pay off all of Colombia's national debt in exchange for an amnesty. That's the absurd amount of money this man has and the absurd amount of power he has. It's kind of a scenario that's almost unrivaled in the modern world, and that's part of just how fantastical about it. He really is kind of like one of those feudal dukes of France who had more power than the king could ever dream of. So he actually does become a congressman as part of the New Liberalism Party. Ironically enough, New Liberalism will become the chief antagonist in his life. And Pablo Escobar is briefly a congressman, but they are able to go back and find a mugshot of him the one time he was arrested years prior. Basically, the one time he was arrested, it's because he didn't bribe the right people enough money. So they were able to basically kick him out of Parliament, and this led him to immense resentment. He had wanted to be the leader of Colombia, and it essentially failed. So around this time, the government starts getting wise to just the scale of his drug empire, and the thing is, he's just such a big target that the various aspects of Colombian society begin to turn against him, just because of the immense fear that he rules through. The man possesses so much power that when New Liberalism, the party he previously tries to join, turns against him, he's able to assassinate a justice minister, a presidential candidate, to power. He comes to power on an anti-narco platform. Now, what's interesting is kind of one of the big events, particularly of the first season, is extradition. The best way to deal with the narco problem is to extradite Colombian drug lords to America, because they're completely separated from their power base. They have no real ability to bribe American guards. America, as corrupt as you might think it is much less corrupt than Colombia. In Colombia, the drugs are basically social clubs where people sometimes go to retire or just to take a break. And they get prostitutes, they get drugs, they get like luxury cells, etc. So extradition means that they have to spend most of their lives basically in a crappy 8x10 cellar, whatever it is, and they have no hope of ever getting back home and getting back to their power base. So that's kind of a really interesting aspect. And you have a lot of the Colombian politicians who really dislike this and feel that Colombia should be able to stand on its own 2 feet. And kind of where a lot of the red pill aspects of this comes in is the show is rather generous towards the police, particularly towards the police willingness to use violence. If anything, the show basically says one of the core problems was that the police weren't willing to go far enough. In the show, whenever the police actually start abandoning some of the tying their hands behind their back and just start torturing or assassinating the narcos, that's really when the government starts to have success. They stop trying to capture them, etc. They treat it as a real war, and they actually start to have some success against the narcos. Um, Now, what else is kind of interesting that happens is the Colombian government starts to achieve things when it massively kind of starts to centralize power in the person of the president. Because the president is considered, and rightly so, the least corrupt office in Colombia. He's the hardest to bribe, partially because he has the most national attention. So the president who gets elected on the anti-narco platform is not really corrupt at all. He has to make some bad decisions, largely because of just the impossibility of his situation. Um, but overall, he is much less corrupt than the vast majority of the country he rules over. All the local mayors are corrupt or are much easier to intimidate, largely because they don't have their own armies. The Sicarios are larger than the police forces of pretty much all the Colombian municipalities put together. And the National Army, because they're paid better, they're trained better, and they're drawn from better families, tend to be much less corrupt overall. And this leads to more or less a full war between the government and the narcos. And the narcos have to start doing mass terror attacks where they just have huge car bombs, and they just start indiscriminately killing the population, agreeing to remove extradition and come to a truce with them. What's interesting is this actually succeeds, and this is kind of how fantastical the whole thing is. Part of the surrender conditions is that Pablo Escobar will serve a maximum of 5 years, and he will be allowed to build his own prison, which they built in a hill overlooking Medellin, which is called Club Escobar, which has prostitutes, a casino, drugs, etc., a soccer field, he's also a jacuzzi, and he's also allowed to staff the prison with his own guards. So he just basically spends his days hanging out there with his sicarios and running his drug empire from it. And he's able to force that just through his sheer power, etc. But we also see kind of the problems with men like him. He doesn't really have a grand vision. As time goes on, he becomes more and more kind of disinterested in his drug empire. I guess because he's basically just won, and there's not really anywhere else for him to go or to achieve. His dreams of becoming the president of Colombia have failed, and there's no real where really to go up. He's one of the richest men on earth. He has tens of thousands of loyal followers. He doesn't really have any ideology or vision of the world. So he just increasingly starts getting depressed and disinterested, and the forces just kind of conspire around him. There's something called victory sickness that happens when you win too often, and there's a general lack of opposition or a general lack of a real challenge to you. I think this is kind of what happened to the West, and we can kind of see this in the figure of Pablo Escobar. Basically, he was kind of in a position that Nero was in. He had no friends and no enemies. He didn't have anyone that he would listen to, especially after some of his lieutenants and his best friends start getting killed by the government and rival cartels. And as such, he doesn't have anyone to give him advice. He increasingly becomes excessively arrogant. Like when he's in jail, he starts collecting a war tax. He has more than enough money to pay for his imprisonment himself, but he starts basically extorting the other narcos in his empire for extra money to pay for his imprisonment. He lives an increasingly lavish lifestyle, which none of which he really cares about. It's kind of just it's interesting. You can kind of really see the complacency and decadence that has plagued so many other empires throughout history, kind of in the character of Pablo Escobar. Maybe that's kind of one of the more interesting things about this series is you see the basically the rise from nothing, the golden age, and the decline of kind of this mini state within the lifetime of one man. You see the Medellin cartel um, join together, rapidly expand, reach the zenith of its power, and then basically grow complacent and disinterested. You see it become a victim of its own success as rivals are formed from kind of the disaffected members. At the end of season one, we have the Cali cartel, which is kind of a rival organization that's similar to the Medellin cartel, but is more classy and resorts to less mass violence and is more interested in paying off politicians and getting political favors than kind of the thuggery. Don't get me wrong, they're still horrific criminals, but they're classier about it and they're more subtle about it. So we see them, the increasingly resentful Colombian government and paramilitaries start to come and take down Pablo Escobar. We also see him increasingly just disinterested in dealing with the whole situation. He still has the money and power to just recruit an army of sicarios and devastate his enemies, but he's kind of gone through a depression. He's excessively centralized power in his position, and centralized power can work. I mean, it largely works in Colombia in the show when the president takes centralized power, but Pablo Escobar has just become disinterested in the centralized power, and he keeps basically killing people who try to share in his authority. He's very much a live by the sword, die by the sword figure. Everyone is scared to question him. Everyone's scared to provide any advice to him. Anyone's scared to really do anything else that would help him, really. Um, and yeah, it's a very kind of interesting as we see the rise and fall of the man. Season one doesn't go to his eventual death. But we see at the very end of the series the rise of, I think it's Pepes, or Pepos, which is people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. So basically, all the people whose families he's killed get together, and they basically form a paramilitary that just starts killing members of the Medellin cartel, in particular trying to target its leadership. We also see America's efforts to intervene in the conflict. America is portrayed as being somewhat unfocused and to an extent incompetent, but largely trying to do the right thing, either trying to deal with the guerrillas or deal with Pablo Escobar. The guerrillas being kind of the Marxists. Interestingly, the relationship between Escobar and the guerrillas is dealt with a fair amount. The guerrillas initially try to extort him for money, but he basically embarks upon a campaign of extermination until they swear fealty to him. And so they swear fealty to him, and he uses them to attack the Supreme Court, the Palace of Justice in Colombia, where they burn all the evidence the government has gathered on him and his organization and assassinate the majority of the Supreme Court, basically to help to just try and scare them and prevent further legal action against him. So overall, Narcos I think is an excellent series. I think it shows a lot of power dynamics. I think it shows a lot of mass psychology, like how does the public respond to violence? How is politics affected by violence? How does kind of personality shape the course of history? So I think that's something we often forget. We often tend to see things as just the product of sociological and economic factors, but a lot of the time there's also personalities and being in the right place at the right time and how that alters history. So overall, I think there's an immense amount, and I can only cover some of it because it's a very deep, well thought out series. But it's definitely very interesting from any kind of political science or political perspective. Ideology is not really a primary concern in the series, um, but kind of self-image, kind of myth, um, kind of culture is very paramount, and just how society responds to crisis. So I highly recommend Narcos. Go watch it. This is Argent Templar signing out.